So first, thanks to the Bitcoin Wednesday community here for having me. I'm excited to be back in Amsterdam. It's been several years. You guys know how to do New Year's, for sure. And even as a Texan, I'm officially afraid of fireworks. But it was beautiful. So with that, I'll dive in. So the title of my presentation is about proving mainly the right to be forgotten in GDPR. And I think we booked this talk several months ago, and so a lot has evolved both in the ecosystem as well as even changes to the regulation and also with Transmute itself. So I thought I would give you more of a casual overview of what we're doing, and there is a few slides about GDPR and how we address the right to be forgotten. So I'll start actually with an anecdote from my holidays that kind of gets into what our first product addresses, which is identity, largely in the enterprise space. So I'm probably one of the farthest from a decentralization purist in the room today, but I think that this story gets at the heart of the problem, at least from an American perspective. So over the holiday, I was at home with family, and I was actually washing the dishes with my dad late one night after we'd hosted friends and family, and everyone else was asleep. And we were talking about my recent decision to totally quit Facebook. And I've been a founder for 2 years in the privacy space. I feel like a hypocrite. I have to do this. I was mourning that my generation has lost the ability to critically think and all of these things. And he's voicing concerns about physical and financial, security because of all the information that's being put out there. He's in law enforcement. And so we're going back and forth about this, and we kind of are ending the discussion agreeing that it's kind of egregious that the same entities who are dictating our experience of privacy and the concerns around it and how to manage our identity's privacy have so much power and so much hand in deciding what kinds of legislation, at least in the States, are going to be put in place to protect the consumer. And while we're finishing the conversation, we're turning off the lights, he's getting ready to say goodnight, he says, "Alexa, turn off the Christmas lights." And at that point, I went back into my room and thought about that and laughed a lot about it, but then thought really hard about what that means for someone who's trying to, and has been for the last couple years, sell this idea of self-sovereign identity into the enterprise, which they hate, by the way. And what I think that it really comes down to is thinking through how, while most of us in this room probably really buy into self-sovereignty and self-sovereign identity because we're already invested in decentralization as a philosophy. Philosophy is unfortunately not enough. And actually, convenience does for better or for worse, supersede a lot of the things that we in this community are working towards. And this is exactly what Transmute found when we went to the enterprise and tried to sell more distributed identity solutions, is that they basically convenience sells, and two aspects of convenience in particular that enterprises are trying to address. The first being access, and that's the first one that I want to talk about today. What are some other technologies that you can describe the evolution, which basically its trajectory has provided more access to more consumers? I think probably the most, the example that comes to my mind most immediately is just moving the computer to the desktop, to the laptop, to our hands. As a vinyl collector, I think of moving music from something that is manual to analog to digital to something that is downloadable, and we can all access it and we can all carry it with us. So the two areas of convenience, or two ways to provide convenience as an enterprise, is accessibility and portability. And I think that this is part of what explains kind of the evolution of SaaS businesses and observing enterprises basically scrambling to scale. And then as the first presenter, Oliver, I think, well, I'll get to that picture a second, but the result of them scrambling to address scale is that they're sacrificing security, just by the nature of the infrastructure development and how they've chosen to support their hunt for the customer, right? And then they can't have downtime. So once you've captured the customer, then you're on the hook for a certain kind of reliability. And this is really unfortunate because we're still not addressing all the aspects of convenience, actually, with so many different kinds of users now being able to do everything and anything on the internet. You now have tons of various accounts. If you're a large enterprise and you have multiple subsidiaries in different jurisdictions, you have the problem of redundant and fragmented identity data that's difficult to manage, that's creating a security problem even with the best security practices because of the redundancy and the fragmented nature of it. You also have marketing and risk teams who are seeing insufficient views of their customer. And so even if they have these massive amounts of data, what can they do with it? One of the first enterprises that we worked with at Transmute had this exact problem, and their marketing team couldn't tell us how many customers use service X that also use service Y. They were identical in the same jurisdictions, these services. They had acquired both of them in the same year. As an American, that's egregious. Europe has a lot more respect for personal data, and we'll get into that a little bit. And so this exploration into the enterprise, as well as trying to sell a bunch of open source repos that addressed this from a philosophical perspective instead of a product perspective, led us down the path of a lot of product research, where we found that this is a massive problem. Obviously, we're seeing this image on the news constantly. We're no stranger to the breaches, but we might be a stranger to how much it's costing us. So the global impact of these breaches is rapidly reaching about $6 trillion a year. And US sources have it at about 80% of these breaches are caused by compromised identity and access. So not only is this very expensive pain, one reason that we started down this road and are starting with identity to solve it, but also you can't build any DApp without solving for identity.
Are you serious? About 6 trillion?
Yes.
You know how much that is?
I mean, that's what...
You know, worldwide debt is 250 trillion, 6 trillion. So how do you quantify it?
So honestly, I took that from a lot of marketing reports, the 6 trillion stat specifically, and I have a source slide I can share, but I did not count it myself.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. All of those figures were in US dollars, I should specify, so yes. So a little bit less, yeah. So this is kind of brings me to our first product, which I'll get more into the larger platform at the end of this slide, but I'm really excited to share because I have some screenshots from our alpha, and we launched the beta over the holidays. But it's called Transmute ID. And so when I mentioned that we're not decentralization purists, we use centralized technology. In our work with enterprises and in our exploration to how what we look at as analog technologies like the cloud have been adopted, we think it's pretty impossible to believe that especially enterprises are going to make big infrastructure changes overnight. And because of the scalability challenges with the protocols that we work on, which are largely Ethereum and EVM-based protocols, these things are not going to be addressed in time to solve some of the problems that we're facing that are more imminent. So Transmute ID solves, at its base level, has 3 different functions. Identity and creation management, basically authentication or attesting to claims, and providing and authorizing business requests. So this is like who can do what, and what credentials do they have that say that they can. So we'll get into supply chain examples shortly. And then verifiable business claims. And our kind of tagline that we're playing with now is identity is a pattern in time. And I have a link at the end that I'll share, but this is because the smart contract that the decentralized piece of Transmute ID is built upon is just an event sourcing smart contract. So all of our developer tools, which are all open source, and I'm happy to share, are built for JavaScript and React Redux developers. And my technical counterpart and CTO, well, we both came from healthcare and biotech, but in particular, the event sourcing framework, at least in the United States, is used pretty pervasively in healthcare because a patient experiences a variety of events, and this is something that is modular and can be transferred to lots of different use cases. And so we've adopted that for our identity module because any DApp or whether centralized application or decentralized application that starts with identity, this needs to be a very modular component. So how does it work? So I'll save us a little bit of time and go into the use case specific piece. So we get a lot of inbound and work with a lot of supply chain companies, which at least all the research that I'm going to share has been done in the United States. We've surveyed probably 75 or so professionals, security professionals and process professionals in that space, and found that a lot of what's going on is manual, but the logistics companies themselves are responsible for providing those logs that are manual right now of attesting to, do these truck drivers, we'll call them truck drivers for this example, have the credentials that they say that they have, are they valid, and can they pick up this load? For instance, do they have a special insurance to take a tobacco load versus something worth more? And so in the case of Transmute ID, we integrate with existing identity solutions already and existing cloud providers. So when we go into a company, the first thing we want to find out is who are the identities that they're tracking. We usually want to start with something like, or just one. So in this case, we'll start with a trucker. What kinds of credentials do they need to have authenticated before they can be authorized to work with your company? So in this case, we'll say that a trucker needs to submit their Twix or TSA or driver's license, basically to be attested to. And so the supplier requests it. So you can see that the trucking company would request it. And right now, let's say that they're doing manually, or even if they're not doing it manually, let's say they use something like Okta to provide identities to all of their employees. So maybe the supplier, maybe we need to integrate with that. So we have that set up as well. And so what would happen is they would create, onboard them to Transmute ID, which basically involves, much like UPort, just your name, whatever credentials are required to get an account for that use case. Ours is an enterprise solution, so we tailor that to the use case. And so in this case, it would be your Twix or TSA card, your driver's license, your name, probably your date of birth. Then the supplier can request carrier credentials from the trucker, or the trucker can submit a claim that has their credentials. And all credentials you'll see in the screenshots to follow are not flagged if they're self-attested. They just says this is a claim that I'm making. But to actually be authorized to do anything for this particular logistics company, you would need to have then the receiving party or the supplier authenticate that credential. Once the credentials have been accepted as proof or authenticated, there are cases where, depending on the process, you'll have to go through the whole process again to say, okay, now I want to take this specific load. Do you authorize me to do that? And each of these events, both creating the account, submitting the credential, each one of the credentials, submitting the request that they be authenticated, whether or not that was rejected or denied, each of these events is being tracked by this event sourcing smart contract and is automatically hooked to, often in our case with enterprise companies, a private fork of the Ethereum blockchain, or something like JP Morgan's Quorum. So the value that this is providing is it's a step towards a more self-sovereign or decentralized future. But in the near term, it's offering something that immutability and the immutable proof of just events in the order in which they occurred can help with today, which is easy auditability and the beginnings of the ability to build reputation within some of these marketplaces. And then finally, portability, which is the second thing which is another thing that you sell when you want to sell convenience. So these are a few screenshots from our alpha. So these have improved, but you can see that if a user or supplier logs into their dashboard, just their immediate dashboard is going to have the history of the claims and credentials and attestations that they've interacted with or submitted for their ID. You can see that in their account, so in their cloud-based wallet, they have the various keys. And you can see a log of credentials here that are either now proofs because they've been attested to, or claims that need to be either rejected or still attested to. So then to circle kind of back to the presentation title about GDPR. So at Transmute, we have built everything with compliance and regulation in mind. So in the US, working with enterprises, it means that we've had to think about things like the NIST digital identity standards, HIPAA, which we're keenly familiar with. But we've also taken the initiative because of how enterprises work, they have their eye on emerging standards and regulation as well. So we sit on the W3C working group for decentralized identifiers. We're contributors to Microsoft Research's decentralized identity implementations of the W3C spec. We are members of the DIF. And in addition to that, we talk a lot about GDPR compliance. Also, one of our lead engineers is French, and so that leads us to talk a lot about GDPR compliance.
Really sorry to stop you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll wrap this up really quickly, but we were basically just getting into specifically the GDPR use case and what our product, what are some of the best practices that we follow to basically ensure our customers remain GDPR compliant, because remember, we don't replace existing IAA systems, we integrate with them. And so I would say the big three that we talk about a lot are only storing hashes, never personal identifying information on blockchain. I think everyone in this room is very familiar with that. And to use different key, be able to generate and store and use different key pairs depending on what type of transaction, so that you can basically reduce the ability to correlate among them. So this, unless you want to. So I imagine a future maybe where the implications of decentralized identity or self-sovereign reputation rather is one where I can take my 5 stars from Uber and I can carry them with me to Lyft or whatever the new version is. But there are lots of scenarios where you don't want the cross-correlation and the user needs to be able to avoid that. And then finally offering the ability to the users to actually own and manage their data. So that's pretty much unheard of in the US right now, but we view our product as a pipeline to that. So when we engage with at least US-based enterprises, we generally have to have a plan to migrate to something more decentralized, but start with the existing systems that they have and leverage only the distributed ledger for the immutable audit log. So I have a couple architecture slides that I thought would be interesting. They demonstrate how little of distributed ledger tech we actually use in the solution today. So just in the lower right-hand box is where we plug and play basically a variety of protocols. So I think I have this slide somewhere else in here I'll flip to, but Transmute ID is the first module built on and the most integral part of the Transmute platform. Which is a larger decentralized application engine where the idea is that you can plug and play various storage, computation, basically different microservice providers into an application. So we use Kubernetes very heavily on the back end, and if you're familiar with that tool at the enterprise level, that allows us to basically plug together really disparate kinds of technologies. So we've built a variety of proprietary, we call them adapters, that sit in between those containers. And we've spent a lot of time vetting whether or not there's an enterprise market for things like distributed store and compute, and whether or not to bring out kind of the incentivized side of the platform, bring it online. Yet, in our research, which included some of the major enterprise storage providers, they weren't even investing in distributed store compute yet. And so we feel very strongly that the focus on identity is the hook that starts to build the bridge towards something more fully decentralized. And just for the sake of being proud of them, this is my co-founder and CTO. His background is in social network botnet, malware, basically everything that's on the news all the time in Texas right now, and cybersecurity. And this is our team based in Texas. We recently partnered with Oracle, in addition to Techstars and MobilityX, which is the Daimler Mercedes brand in Texas, or in Austin. This is where you can learn more. All of our developer tools are open source. This link will take you to all of our repos, but it's highlighting the Transmute framework, which is the event source framework that I mentioned we use in all of our technologies. And then finally, this is the overall platform architecture. And this is very slanted towards Oracle right now because I grabbed it from that last deck, but we currently support all of the top 3 major public cloud providers and Oracle. And thank you. I'll take any questions or over a beer after this.
Questions for Karyl?
I have a question. How does this compare to other decentralized identity or self-folded identity services like Bloom ID or Self-Key?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we view a lot of our competitors as actually partners in this stage right now. So we have friends at companies like you mentioned, or at like Uport, who are implementing. They're basically implementing the W3C decentralized identity and identifier spec as well, but they're for the most part all focused on B2C applications or social good applications, and that's absolutely where we started. As well as trying to provide fully decentralized identities to refugees. And then we found that there's a bigger problem that's less understood by the general public, much closer to home. And then the last thing that I didn't say that I think relates to the kind of my PR firm's title of the GDPR love story, improving the right to be forgotten, is the way that we do propose handling that is when you get a request to delete a decentralized identifier, our basic technology allows you to comply with that request. Of course, you need a centralized database to actually delete it, and then the event of that deletion is encrypted and hashed, and that is what is stored, and none of the prior hashes are resolvable. So that's how we handle that.
There's a question.
Yeah, I have a question about price-wise. What's like your revenue model, or how much does it?
Yeah. So right now we're piloting the technology, and so it's more like annual license fees and maintenance fees, very services-enabled enterprise SaaS right now. But our hope is to move towards a fully SaaS model where we have freemium offerings for some of the developer tools as well. So right now what we're doing that is just with those tools is if we've already used them, they're kind of tried and true and tested already. We're just open sourcing as many of those as we can. We obviously can't do that with our customer work, and we use a lot of open source and a few closed source components to combine for the enterprise offerings. But our hope is that we'll bill, once we understand what it means, what the impact of and cost, depending on the formulation of your storage, which is largely centralized in a lot of these use cases, plus hashing on whatever your chosen blockchain is. Once we understand those costs better, we're hopeful that we can apply a model similar to like the Oktas and OAuths of the world, where it's like a per identity basis that scales with how many identities you have.